In my former career as a physicist, one of the tools we use to analyze a problem is what is called a thought experiment. This is a hypothetical yet realistic situation that allows you to think through the potential consequences of whatever principle is at work without actually having to create the situation in question. Of course, this isn't a tool that's only of use in physics. Here, for example, is a thought experiment concerning church life. A church group was making use of the availability of childcare for the first time. They hadn't previously needed childcare for their program, but now some families with small children wanted to attend, and the only way they could do that was if there was childcare. So the request was made to the person responsible for arranging for childcare, and one of the church youth was duly assigned to be there that evening. Now, the church had a budget for providing childcare at such programs and other events. It recognized that doing so would help more people be able to attend, and so it was in the church's own self-interest to have their programs and events be more successful. It wasn't a secret that there was a childcare budget. The church's financial statements were even on the website. And the youth who were asked to provide childcare were told how they could request payment for their services from that budget. So when this particular program was wrapping up, the youth who provided childcare that evening went to the group's leader who'd requested childcare, and he asked her to sign off on the payment request form. Well, this was new to the group's leader, since it was the first time her group had requested childcare. She probably would have signed the form, but as she hesitated, another person who'd been at the program spoke up. "Oh, the church doesn't have any money to pay you," he said, and he pulled a couple of bills out of his pocket to give to the youth. Now, this other person hadn't been part of that church for very long. The group's leader had, and was a lot more familiar with the church's finances, given some of her other responsibilities. But the new person presented as fact his assumption or guess, or whatever you want to call it, that the church either couldn't afford or wasn't willing to invest in the success of its own programs by providing childcare. The fact was, of course, that the church could afford and was willing to invest in the success of its own programs by providing childcare. Many church members pledged and made financial contributions on the basis that it would help their church to offer more programs of more interest to more people, and some of those people would be parents who would need childcare. So why would anyone hold such a strong conviction that the church didn't have any money to pay for childcare? And how would someone quite new to the church come to hold that conviction? So that's a thought experiment concerning church life for you. Any resemblance to an actual situation you may have witnessed or otherwise experienced is purely coincidental. As a thought experiment, it's intended for us to think about the messages that we're giving one another about money. Whether it's a message that's directly articulated, such as the church doesn't have any money to pay for childcare, or more often an unspoken message, such as the placement of a collection jar near the coffee where people are expected to make a donation to pay for their drink. Now, every organization that requires a budget to fund its operations and activities needs to be realistic about its financial resources. But churches tend to exhibit one of two particular cultures. In other words, one of two particular collections of attitudes and behaviors when it comes to financial resources. One such culture is a culture of scarcity, which may be characterized by a focus on what cannot be done, an emphasis on what is wrong, a false modesty around taking credit for work. a disproportionate attention to minor budget lines, and a measure of guilt when it comes to talking about giving. The opposite of a culture of scarcity is then a culture of abundance, which may be characterized by a focus on what can be done, an emphasis on what is right, a willingness to receive credit in order to inspire others, an emotional investment in mission-oriented efforts, and a certain amount of joy in talking about commitment. Think about those two cultures for a moment, and you'll realize that neither of them are really about the current availability of financial resources. You can talk about the exact same set of circumstances from either perspective, the glass being half empty and the glass being half full, both being ways of looking at the same glass of water. So suppose a church committee gets a modest budget for doing its work. Well, a committee with a culture of scarcity would refuse to spend that budget, perhaps on the basis that it wasn't enough to do what they really wanted to do, or perhaps out of a general assumption that the church couldn't really afford even that much. A committee with a culture of abundance, on the other hand, would figure out how best it could use that budget, not only doing their work, but also letting the rest of the church know about it, and then celebrating what it was able to do in support of the church's mission and ministry. When it comes to the next budgeting process, when the congregation decides how much money to assign to different programs for the following year, which committee do you think is going to get more money? The one that acted out of scarcity and didn't do much of anything that anybody knew about? Or the one that acted out of abundance and did good work that could be even better next year with a bigger budget? So the cultures of scarcity and abundance, these collections of attitudes and behaviors, are not so much reflective of the availability of financial resources as they are predictive of them. They are both self-fulfilling prophecies. Unfortunately, it's very easy to fall into a culture of scarcity while it takes intention and effort to embrace a culture of abundance. And that means that a culture of scarcity is practically the default for church life, unless deliberate steps are taken to cultivate a culture of abundance instead. Now, aside from which is actually better for a congregation if it wants to fulfill its mission and ministry and grow and reach more people and do more good in the world, which do you think is more in keeping with Unitarian Universalism? Okay, that's a rhetorical question, but let me explain why, as obvious as the answer may be, it's a question worth asking. I'm going to have to give you some historical context, though. During the 1930s, Unitarian minister, theologian, and activist James Luther Adams was visiting a friend in Germany. He referred to his friend as a liberal, and his friend immediately responded, "Please do not call me a liberal. That word is taboo here, and besides, I am not a liberal." Adams was taken aback, trying to understand how his friend, a distinguished philosopher and a writer whom he considered to be a leading progressive, could be so willing to deny, or could apparently be afraid of, the word liberal. As Adams' biographer Max Stackhouse notes, though, there's been a decades-long and many-sided attack on liberalism. Between the 30s and the 70s, according to Stackhouse, the list of those who have joined in the attack includes fascists, communists, neo-Orthodox Christians, university intellectuals, and anti-intellectual conservatives. In more recent years, we could add the religious right, as well as talk radio and television news hosts who exploit fear and small-mindedness for personal and corporate gain. Following his rude awakening in Germany, Adams recognized the ambiguous roots and character of liberalism, acknowledged the accuracy of some of the criticism, and proceeded to sort the gold from the gravel. Speaking on such topics as the liberalism that is dead and on being human, the liberal way, Adams tried to understand the general idea of liberalism as a progressive force that promotes liberation from tyranny, provincialism, and arbitrariness, and contributes to the meaningful fulfillment of human existence. He also saw the need to clarify the difference between liberal religion and secular liberalism, particularly political liberalism. In Adams' terms, liberal religion must protest the confusions of liberalism itself, taking on in particular what he named the idolatry of possessive individualism, a smokescreen that he claimed conceals a new authoritarianism of corporate economic power and refuses to bear responsibility for its social consequences or be accountable for the character of a society that requires, or at least comfortably tolerates, the built-in poverty of almost 1/3 of the populace. In order to do this, as well as defending itself from the fascists, the communists, the religious right, and so on, liberal religion needed to embrace 5 principles that Adams identified as paramount. Now, it may be that Adams himself did not coin the phrase, the 5 smooth stones of liberal religion, to describe these, but since that phrase was used in publishing an edited collection of his essays and papers while he was still alive, we can assume that he was at least okay with the phrase. The reference is actually to the biblical story of David and Goliath, a story with which most of us in our culture are familiar, at least in broad terms. A story that has become a quick way of framing any account of a small, apparently weak person or group winning against the might of big business, bureaucracy, uncaring HMOs, or greedy banks. The particular part of the story that apparently appealed to Adams' editor is where David selects 5 smooth stones from a nearby stream to arm his sling before he goes to face Goliath. Just one of those stones allows the shepherd boy to defeat the giant warrior, and so the Israelites were able to overcome the superior force of the Philistines. So whether Adams adopted the phrase himself or merely agreed to its use by others, a lot of Unitarian Universalist theology is done in reference to the 5 smooth stones of liberal religion. They are, first, continuous revelation, that revelation is not sealed. Second, covenant, that we choose voluntarily how to be in relationship. Third, justice, that our goal is the beloved community. Fourth, agency, that people make good things happen. And fifth, hope, that ultimate optimism is justified. Now it's the fourth of the smooth stones, agency, that applies when it comes to talking about the self-fulfilling prophecies of scarcity and abundance. In Adam's own words, we deny the immaculate conception of virtue and affirm the necessity of social incarnation. There is no such thing as goodness as such. Except in a limited sense, there is no such thing as a good person as such. In other words, goodness comes through relationship and action. But good things don't happen thanks to individual virtue alone. They happen when people work together to develop societal virtue, as expressed in education, in economic and social organization, in political organization. Without the social incarnation of virtue, Adams explains, freedom and justice in community are impossible. By the same principle, there are no such things in the abstract as scarcity and abundance as such. Rather, they emerge through relationship and action, through our attitudes and behaviors when we are together. So let's think about agency and what it means in practice. There are plenty of messages that we're given in today's society that are trying to convince us that we don't have much agency. You can't fight City Hall is one such message. I'd include in this advertising that comes in the mail that's designed to look like a bill, to try and trick you into paying for something you didn't want, as well as the way that the media tries to keep us in an almost constant state of fear. Then there's what's being preached in a number of evangelical churches under the rubric of the gospel of prosperity. The idea that God just wants you to be happy and healthy and, oh yes, rich, if only you'll do what God wants you to do, which includes going online and making a donation right now. The secular version of that, which in my opinion is actually worse, is the law of attraction, as popularized in particular by the movie and book of the same name, The Secret. The problem with claiming that it's positive thoughts and attitudes that bring good things into someone's life is that it also blames people for their own suffering, as if the reason that somebody got cancer is because they weren't thinking positively enough about being healthy. Now, attitude does matter, of course, but that's because it affects your behavior. And that can be in self-fulfilling ways. Go around being a grumpy so-and-so, always complaining about how nobody likes you, how nobody wants to be your friend, and guess what? People probably will still clear of you. Taking another example, what about gratitude? We consider it to be a virtue, and not just something to be practiced at Thanksgiving, but every day. A way of life that can help us move from dwelling on what we lack to celebrating what we have. As addiction recovery specialist and self-help author Melody Beattie puts it, gratitude unlocks the fullness of life. It turns what we have into enough and more. It turns denial into acceptance, chaos to order, confusion to clarity. It can turn a meal into a feast, a house into a home, a stranger into a friend. Gratitude makes sense of our past, brings peace for today, and creates a vision for tomorrow. It's agency, of course, that we apply when we look at what we have and decide how we're going to think about it and decide what we're going to do with it. It's agency that's employed when we celebrate what we have, appreciating how our needs are met in a spirit of abundance. And it's our knowledge of our own agency that gives us faith in humanity, that lets us see the hope of human potential, something that is at the heart of Unitarian Universalism. A culture of scarcity, on the other hand, represents a cynicism towards human potential and is thus the antithesis of Unitarian Universalism. A culture of scarcity downplays the wonderful things that a congregation does on many different fronts, such as a great music program or a small group ministry that touches hearts and saves lives. A culture of scarcity dismisses the dedication of the many volunteers it takes for a congregation to live into its mission and ministry. And so a culture of scarcity is a major hindrance to a congregation's ability to continue doing those wonderful things. Rather, it's a culture of abundance that will ultimately allow for a congregation's vision to be fulfilled, living the promise of a congregation like this fellowship as a place to grow not only individual souls, but also the collective soul of our wider society. Scarcity and abundance are self-fulfilling prophecies in that we apply our agency, whether intentionally or unwittingly, in order to bring them about. When we recognize how we might be behaving in ways that dwell on what we lack, rather than celebrating what we have, particularly once we recognize that how we use our money and other resources says a lot about who we are. Then we understand how important it is to practice the abundance to which our faith makes claim. So let us engage in the work of transforming ourselves, as individuals and as individuals in covenanted community. Let us transform ourselves away from a culture of scarcity and into a culture of abundance. Let us, in fact, live into the abundance of our faith by asserting that we can indeed transform ourselves for the better, for one another, and for the healing of our world. So may it be.